People should ask themselves, really, what would have happened to liberalism in Australia if there'd been no Menzies?
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. When explaining why he chose the name Liberal for his new political party in 1944, Robert Menzies said, "We took the name Liberal because we were determined to be a progressive party, willing to make experiments, in no sense reactionary, but believing in the individual, his rights and his enterprise, and rejecting the socialist panacea." But 81 years on, the word progressive now implies left of centre or even further left, and the term liberal in North America as well connotes a left-leaning tendency. Debates in Australia still ensue about whether Menzies was really a conservative or was he a liberal, a classical liberal or some sort of moderate. And this term conservative in Australia, which once before was barely used, is now gaining more and more traction to connote the centre-right. It's clear that over time the meaning of political terms changes. And it doesn't just change in Australia, it changes across national borders. Joining me to discuss the curious evolution of political terms, particularly in Australia, is Robert Menzies Institute Professorial Fellow, Greg Melleuish. Lovely to have you once again on Afternoon Light, Greg.
Afternoon, Georgina. How are you?
I'm very well. Well, Greg, this is, I think, one of those sort of vexed debates. And as Australians who, you grow up in Australia, you know the Liberal Party, the Labor Party, and Liberal, certainly capital L Liberal, has a sort of reflexive meaning of centre-right politics, small government, free markets, individual freedoms, are policies designed to support the family and the like. You go on a plane elsewhere or you watch TV, YouTube these days, and when they talk about the Liberals, they mean very, very different things. So why is it that term Liberal has such vastly different connotations in, say, America compared to Australia, do you think?
I think it's to do with the particular way in which their political systems and culture evolved over time. So if you look at Canada, for example, they've got Conservatives and Liberals, although just to be a little upsetting in that regard, at one time I believe the Conservatives called themselves Progressive Conservatives, whatever that means. So actually I think one of the things that's important is that neither Canada nor America has a Labor Party.
Right, yeah.
So when the political divide happened here, as it did in Britain, there was only room for two sides of politics, and the divide was Liberal Labor, not Liberal Conservative. And the same way in Britain, if you look at one time they had three teams. They had the Liberals, they had the Conservatives, and they had Labor. And what happened was that the Conservatives survived, but the Liberals did not, or rather they mutated into other strange forms. So it's to do with the way in which I think specific political divides occur. A few years ago, actually, I reviewed a book which had the title, "Why Doesn't the United States Have a Labor Party?"
And why doesn't it?
And that's an interesting question.
Yeah.
They had a very strong trade union movement, but for a range of reasons, it never developed into a social democratic or a Labor Party. So in some ways, we could say America was the unusual one rather than Australia. It all depends on the way you look at what's the normal pattern of development.
So in the US context, the classical liberal ideas like free trade and local autonomy, I mean, they tended to have a sort of association with the South, which are the slave-owning part of the country, and then, of course, that becomes discredited as history shows. I mean, is that a problem for the development of liberalism then in the United States?
Oh, I think race and slavery poisoned politics in America in a way that never happened here. People can go on about race in Australia, but it's not anything like what it was in America. So you're right. I mean, the Democrats were the Jim Crow people. They were the ones that engaged in lynching and tar and feathering. That's another one that they were quite keen on in the 19th century, I believe. So, but the small town, I think, is interesting because if you go back and read Alexis de Tocqueville, he sees that as the foundation of American democracy, is the whole small town, people basically looking after themselves and doing things for themselves. So that's an interesting thing because Australia really doesn't have anything quite comparable to that. We had centralised colonial governments.
And then you see in America that libertarian strain that I guess sort of comes out of that much stronger than you do in Australia.
Oh, much stronger in the US, although, who's the icon of American libertarianism? Actually isn't an American. It's a former Russian, Ayn Rand.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, and of course she's going back to the 90s and so on. Now, she was the great icon for all the people of Silicon Valley.
So when do you think that the term liberal in the United States diverged with how it was understood in Australia? Were we just so disconnected that they didn't relate, or?
There's another strange movement in the late 19th, early 20th century in America called progressivism, which is about sort of using universities to produce knowledge for the state to develop things. We had some progressivists here as well, but nowhere near the same extent. And it was also about using science to create a better world. So Americans began to move down that path, I think, in the late 19th, early 20th century. And it was very much a sort of an elite movement. It's interesting how early disdain for the ordinary people appears in elements of American liberalism.
And that progressivism, that starts to be called liberalism, does it, as time goes on in America?
That starts to be called liberalism. People often refer to a thing called social liberalism, closest of which in this country is probably deaconite liberalism, which is using the state to create the conditions under which individuals can thrive. So if individuals are going to thrive, then the state has to intervene. And there's a certain logic to this. I mean, if you don't get education provided, if people don't get proper food and diet, if they can't put a roof over their heads, how can they possibly be good citizens?
Yeah. Does that then becomes what we might describe as sort of a quality of outcomes rather than a quality of opportunity, where the state is driving everyone to the same outcome?
I think that might be the case in America. I don't think that's necessarily the case for social liberals. I mean, if you look at Australia, although people will say someone like John Howard was some sort of libertarian, he believed in the welfare state. He believed in doing things. He believed in using the state to help people. But I don't think he believed in equality of outcomes. He just believed in providing the environment under which people could themselves take advantage of their circumstances and thrive. That's the difference.
In the US, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, World War II president, is obviously a key figure of the left, but also in that development of the modern implication of liberal as standing for big government, progressive politics, the New Deal, this sort of idealism that you see following on in Woodrow Wilson as well. So, I mean, these figures are crafting that idea that we might understand today of liberalism in the American context. Do you think? Are they foundational?
Yeah, so I remember Woodrow Wilson was earlier than Roosevelt, and one of Woodrow Wilson's great achievements was to segregate the White House. So blacks and whites work separately. You can be a progressive liberal and still be a good old-fashioned, as you were saying before, good old-fashioned Southern racist.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of liberalism in America strikes me, particularly since the 60s in particular. It's all about undoing the injustices that weren't resolved by the end of the Civil War, weren't resolved because you could bring about equality, you could proclaim equality in America, but they still had ways around it. So it's much more of a focus of restoring some sort of equality in America. You know, I remember an American just a few years ago telling me that in the 1960s, you could have new housing estates that had covenants on them, no blacks or Jews allowed.
Wow.
No, the racial segregation was quite considerable. It's in a way that, I mean, we had minor sort of segregation, and I know of cases of, with local Aboriginals populations would sit downstairs in a picture theatre and the local whites would sit upstairs. I know that happened about 50 or 60 years ago in some places, but the real segregation that America had. Another story I just heard recently about John F. Kennedy, that Frank Sinatra sang at his inauguration, but Sammy Davis Jr. wasn't invited.
Right, yeah.
No, these are things that don't make sense to us.
No. So FDR, he does his fireside chats and talks about the four freedoms. And Menzies sort of riffs on that a bit with his Forgotten People broadcast. And I know you're doing a very significant piece of work with Dr. Zachary Gorman here on the context of these broadcasts. But, I mean, how does Menzies engage with FDR's liberalism and his talk of freedom? Does he sort of feel that is in the same tradition as he is explaining in terms of his view of Australian liberalism in the 1940s?
Again, what Zach and I hope are developing is that he wanted to keep the democracy bits, he wants to keep the free speech and freedom, but when you get to the more governmental involvement in particularly economic affairs, I think that's not what Menzies was there to do. You have to remember that he's reframing liberalism in Australia in the context of an attempt by a Labor government to use, first of all, wartime powers, which they were able to do, and then a referendum to increase the economic powers of the Commonwealth government that would give them much more control over a whole range of economic matters. So his fight against the 1944 referendum is just as significant, I think, as his Forgotten People. So he frames it, I think, in terms of democracy because that's the way, the Atlantic Charter was framed. That's why he uses that. But I don't think he's in any way taking over an American agenda. He's got an agenda. And in the same way, if you look at what the Brits are doing during World War II, there's none of the sort of some of the madness that surfaces in the Conservative Party during the early years of the war either. They're all about a more militaristic society. Menzies was not a militarist, far from it. So you can see now why he would be a liberal, a distinctively Australian liberal, because he's taking it down a particular road to do with more freedom. He still believes, he still would be very much a social liberal. He doesn't want to get rid of certain things. He was in favour of national insurance before the war. He's not that way. Also, you can see that he's quite different from both the Americans and the Brits.
Yeah, that sort of, I guess, divergence there on the sort of use of the state that you see in the rest of the Anglosphere, but not in Australia in terms of our development liberalism. Why do you think there is that divergence? Is it because of issues like race, or is it something inherent in Australia that we just, didn't see it as fitting in the development of our liberal tradition?
One thing I think is extremely important here is the Constitution. The Constitution, as written, gives the Commonwealth or federal government, whatever you want to call it, quite limited economic powers. So that means that if you look through the history of referenda in Australia, you see attempt after attempt by Labor governments to put forward referenda that will give the Commonwealth government more economic powers to do things. So one reason why we don't have something like the national health system that Britain has, not constitutionally possible. They can't take over that sort of control. And if you look at the referendum, the 1946 referendum about medical thing, it says not to include conscription of doctors. Now, that immediately precludes things like the national health system. Menzies is quite insistent on that getting that in there. So the Constitution, if you want to do more state building, you have to find ways around it, around the Constitution and its consequences. And that's not easy. The only real way it can happen, I think, is through getting judicial interpretations of the Constitution that allow you to do things. But that's not easy either. So the fact that the people who drew up the Australian Constitution, and again, Steve Chavura and I wrote an article about them. They were constitutional conservatives on the one hand, but they were also basically liberals. So the Labor Party had no influence. Early Labor had no influence on the Constitution. The Constitution is a creation of late 19th century liberalism.
Well, I mean, basically the Labor MPs were opposed to federation, weren't they? I mean, I think it was just Andrew Fisher, wasn't it? It was the only one who
They weren't necessarily in favour. I think they thought, and again, this is true in the early years of the 20th century as well, they thought if you were going to get changes, you worked through state governments. And at that point, the state governments were much richer than the Commonwealth government was. It didn't have a lot of funds or a lot to do. So they thought the game. It's only really with Billy Hughes in 1910 that Labor becomes really quite staunchly nationalist in its approach. And a lot of that's to do with industrial relations, arbitration court things. But then they changed their focus and became much more interested. So there's a massive fight between Hughes and Holman over the powers of the Commonwealth government in 1910 referendum. Holman thinks that we don't want to do these things necessarily at national level, and Hughes is much more nationalistic about it.
The term conservative has become used much more in Australia over the last 20 years, sort of to really describe the centre-right of Australian politics. It's not a term that was historically used in Australia, and it's even in my lifetime I've noticed, journalists will say, the conservative side of politics, which, 30 years ago that wasn't the way it was described. Why are Americans much more comfortable using the term conservative? And, of course, the other important question is, and the British, but we'll start with the Americans first, Greg.
Americans, because Americans' conservatism is different to Australian or British conservatism, in that it's sort of rooted, I think, much more in small communities and in the protection of traditional values that those communities represent. So conservatism, it doesn't mean what it means in Britain. It's a much more, I suppose you'd say, communitarian sort of version. And I think that's why where Trump is, the sort of people he appeals to are people who have been uprooted by change over the last few years. If you look at what's happened to the American small town and small cities, they've been devastated, particularly with the destruction of manufacturing and so on. And that means you have what I would call deracinated people who want something to hold on to. Although one can say this process is also happening in the UK at the moment. Whereas conservatism in Britain was much more attached to things like the established church, the aristocracy, established institutions, perhaps the great universities and so on. So the two types of conservatism are quite distinct in America and in Britain, I think.
And in terms of the Australian experience, where obviously modern Australia is a creation of British settlement, we inherit the institutions that British settlers bring, but we don't inherit Conservative Party, which is really interesting. Why is that?
We didn't inherit Toryism.
Yeah.
Basically, again, it's a subtle difference, but conservatism and Toryism has a certain flavour to it, doesn't it? When you think of a Tory, a certain image of an old man in a club.
It's a pejorative term. You don't think
it's not. Well, it was originally a pejorative term, but I think they were quite proud to be Tories. But the thing in Australia is you never had any of that.
No.
Even the Conservatives of the middle of the 19th century were what in the 19th century would be called Whigs. You know, people like W.C. Wentworth or James MacArthur, they were Whiggish. Where they were conservative was that they didn't believe in universal franchise for a whole range of reasons. And there was no established church. So what was there exactly to fight about? And the traditional institutions of British society just weren't here. Even something like the Anglican Church in Australia, it was never established, but it was more influenced by democracy and the liberal attitude of its populace. And actually that's also, I think, true of the Catholic Church as well, because the Catholic Church in the 19th century, interestingly enough, one of the papal encyclicals said no way to liberalism. And yet there were lots of Catholics in Australia who were good liberals. You know, it's one of those interesting things. But seeing what happened in Australia, and it happened in Canada as well, is that as everybody was basically a liberal, this new term came up called liberal conservative to distinguish those liberals who are more conservative as to those who are more progressively liberal. And that's more like the spectrum, I think, that developed in this country. So there were different types of conservatives. And then we get to the end of the 19th century, and you're talking about the term conservative. The new progressive liberals, the Deaconites, they could then start calling the old free trade liberals conservatives.
And they did that used conservative as a term of, attack.
A term of attack.
We'll malign the George Reid types.
George Reid was a liberal,
but his ideas are more classically liberal than Alfred Deakin's, and yet he gets tarred with, "Oh, you're a conservative," as a sort of.
But that's because conservatism progresses, and the way it's progressed is to turn itself into a more state-oriented form. So that's yesterday's liberalism. Therefore, it's conservatism. So, I mean, these are rhetorical terms. They're not really much use in categorising what these people actually believe, but it is part of the argy-bargy that goes on.
And figures like Alfred Deakin, as you said, and newspaper proprietor David Syme, they're really instrumental in developing this Deaconite liberalism, as it comes to be known, but is quite populist, isn't it?
Populist. I mean, again, if you look at Bruce Smith, who was probably the only major theoretician of liberalism in Australia in the late 19th century, he blamed a lot of this on the way in which democracy operated, and basically votes could be. You pander to the person and you do things. The state increasingly does things for people. So, but then he would have been denounced as a conservative.
Right.
And I should add with Bruce Smith, what's interesting is he's one of the few people who refused to support white Australia.
Is that right? And he was a so-called conservative.
Yeah, well, they would be considered conservatives because the progressive thing to do at the time was to build white Australia.
Yeah, and like the progressive side of politics in the United States was to erect race-based barriers in society.
Well, although America also had its version of white Australia. It didn't want Chinese coming on the west coast of America either.
Alfred Deakin was able to declare in the early years of the 20th century, in the early years of Federation, that a colonial liberal is one who favours state interference with liberty and industry at the pleasure and in the interest of the majority, while those who stand for the free play of individual choice and energy are classed as conservatives.
Yes.
I mean, that's as clear a statement as you can get, and it really challenges completely our contemporary understanding of liberalism.
Well, but liberalism's mutated on several occasions, even throughout the 20th century as well. Was it someone like John Gordon who said we're all socialists now?
Sounds about
something
right.
along those lines. From memory, I don't want to be thinking he's searching his name, but I've got a suspicion he said something. I mean, you've also got someone like Frederick Eggleston, who was a liberal, who a bit older than Menzies, who said, "Oh, I'm a true liberal. I'm a Fabian."
Right. Yeah.
People use words in different ways. That what seems inevitable at one point of time seems like yesterday's fashion 20 years later.
I mean, Shakespeare gets it right, doesn't he, when he says, "What's in a name? A rose by any other name would smell as sweet." I mean, really, we know the ideas, but the way we name them really changes, and it is challenging when you're looking at political history and looking at the way parties and political philosophies are named 80 years ago, that they don't necessarily sit neatly today.
That's one reason why it's harsh to condemn Menzies, because he wasn't a classical liberal. He was a liberal within the framework of his time. But he was infinitely more liberal than what the Labor Party I was thinking of Curtin, but I was thinking more of his great enemy, Doc Everett, was proposing, which was a much more centralised state. When we look at Menzies, we've got to remember what he was opposed to.
Yes. It's often quoted, Menzies is often quoted when he talks about naming the Liberal Party Liberal because he wanted it to be a progressive party. Progressive is another term that has changed in meaning, and it's really interesting in Menzies' writings. There's liberal, there's progressive, and there's social justice. All these terms are much challenged in our understanding today. But tell me about how we understand Menzies' use of the term progressive in the 1940s, Greg.
Oh, well, I think that goes with his support for education. So progressive means the sorts of views held by an educated person, if that makes sense. He supported things like, he was supportive of science, but he was wary of its bad possibilities. I think in many ways, Menzies was, like Eggleston, what I'd call an aristocratic liberal. He thought that the basis of a democratic society was to throw up good leaders who would work on behalf of the people. He thought himself to be one of those, which is, I suppose, what you would expect, given that he'd been a scholarship boy and everything. He was a sign that the system worked. But he really did think that, I think that progression meant good judgment in a polity in which good people were elected to lead the country who had the best interests of the country at heart.
I mean, because now it would mean, pushing against tradition and pushing against the way things have always been to I guess some aspiration of a better place, that the people are more equal and that the marginalised are no longer marginalised. So you progress through that. But I mean, Menzies had an enlightened view of women in higher education and politics. But of course, it was of its time. There was a sort of a social conservatism that we don't really have today around the role of women in the workforce once they got married. I mean, the Commonwealth public servants, if you were a female and you got married, you then needed to retire, basically. I mean, that was something Menzies didn't withdraw throughout his entire prime ministership.
Well, in the Commonwealth Public Service before World War II, there was basically no graduate recruitment. They didn't recruit people as graduates either. They didn't recruit educated people. There was a couple that were recruited in the mid-30s. But that was, again, that sounds strange to us. Why didn't they want to have the best, the educated either? It was a very, very different world to ours today. But no, progressive, I think, to be fair to Menzies, his progressive values were rooted in a love of traditional institutions. So particularly parliamentary institutions. And so there was no way he was going to tear up a parliamentary system, try to improve it, so to speak, in order to further so-called progressive values. I mean, when he wrote The Forgotten People in 1942, Doc Everett was talking about a horse and buggy constitution that needed to be got rid of because it was no longer relevant in an age where we no longer use the horse and buggy.
And it was only 40-odd years old by then. So
I know, but that's an actual description that Everett used. Yeah. He called it a horse and buggy constitution. So, again, we have to realise 1942, it was such a terrible year. Yeah. No Stalingrad, no El Alamein yet. It was, who knows?
Yeah,
it was everything was on a knife edge.
Darwin was being bombed. Singapore had fallen. It was as bleak as
it was on a knife edge. So the maintenance of tradition along with progressive values is people should ask themselves really what would have happened to liberalism in Australia if there'd been no Menzies.
Mm. So could we describe him as a sort of Burkean progressive? With that, I know you've described him as a
Burke was a Whig. Burke wasn't a conservative. Burke was a Whig. He was not a Tory, and he was Irish as well. We've got to remember Burke was Irish. That matters.
Yeah.
And of course, Menzies is Scottish, and that matters.
Another term, and I referred to it a bit earlier, that is vexed these days is social justice. And of course, if you on Twitter or whatever social media platform you follow, you'll see accusations of people who are very left-leaning being social justice warriors, and then the retort back is right-wing nut job. So, it's all very civil these days in our public discourse, Greg. But social justice does have a left-leaning connotation, that people who are interested in social justice, pursuing social justice, are doing that in a way to sort of right the wrongs of society, of wrongs of capitalism, of inequities in our society, and you do that through various interventions. What would Menzies, who spoke of social justice, have understood that term to mean?
Oh, that's a difficult one. I don't think he understood. I don't think he meant social justice in the sense of a massive welfare state or anything remotely like that. Remember, the way he describes himself in The Forgotten People puts his position. The trade unions look after the working classes. The bosses look after themselves. I'm here to look after the rest, so to speak. And the other interesting thing about social justice is that in 1942, this was the first or second year that the Catholic bishops of Australia issued their first social justice statement, the majority of which for the next 25 years were written by B.A. Santamaria. He wasn't the author. So obviously social justice was a term that was in the air at the time. And the one thing, when you say it's left-leaning, and this is also important for later Australian political history, Catholic bishops could say, we could nationalise something, or we could do more for ordinary people, for people to help families and so on. But the one thing that the Catholic Church has always believed in is private property. So they weren't socialists in that sense. They weren't socialists. So I think that perhaps might be the case. You can help people but there are certain things that are sacrosanct, and one of those is private property.
Alfred Deakin in 1906 makes a speech in Adelaide where he sort of sets out his party's program and the principles that underlie it. And he argues that his party was marked by this idea of social justice, but it's social justice by trusting the people, which is a different, I guess, conception of this sort of idea of social justice today, which is, using the agency of the state to help various identity groups improve their position in society. I mean, what was it in the Deakin era that he was trying to explain? It sort of seems to be very much linked to individual improvement and personal responsibility that you might actually see in the Menzian tradition.
Although if you look at the legislation that the Deakin government supported, one of which was tariffs, new protection, and the other of which was the arbitration system, then you could say that what Deakinite liberalism achieved was not using the state, but using government processes that would enable, in a way, greater equality or greater assistance for the ordinary person, yes. Although, curious enough, one of the things about Deakinite liberalism is the establishment of the arbitration court with Justice Higgins sitting as the first arbitration court judge, and the establishment of what's known as the basic wage. The basic wage was a wage that every worker was entitled to and which you could not pay anything less. It was never a minimum wage. It was a basic wage, and it was a wage that would enable a man to support a wife and 3 children in, I love this term, modest comfort. But the interesting thing about the idea of a basic wage, and this is sort of has a contemporaneous significance, is that just as we've got Leo XIV as the current Pope, last Leo, who was Leo XIII, he brought out a encyclical called Rerum Novarum, which you may have heard of, Rerum Novarum.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's where the idea of the basic wage comes from.
I see.
In Australian politics.
Right. And Justice Higgins is adopting this, and
he's adopting this.
And
he's
the Deakinite
Irish.
Liberals are supportive of this?
They're very supportive of this idea.
Yes.
And Higgins took the view, which is interesting, that if a company couldn't afford to pay a basic wage, well, it just went to the wall.
Right. Yes. So better to have no jobs than jobs that were paid below the basic wage.
Yes. You couldn't pay below it.
No. Yeah.
It's an interesting way. I mean, it doesn't sound political, but it's interesting about the mindset, that it's a matter of justice, that people are enabled to live. People have often in the past referred to this as workfare rather than welfare.
Yeah.
And one of the other consequences of the basic wage was because a woman didn't have 3 children and a husband to support, therefore you paid women less.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
It entrenched
inequality.
Differential wages. It's a really interesting, but it's just an example of how you can say that something like social justice manifested itself in that decade.
Social justice now has a connection to modern day identity politics, and identity politics is not a modern phenomenon. It's been around since time immemorial. But when do you think social justice became so linked with identity politics? Because this is really something that sort of runs counter to that kind of Catholic teaching of, God's judging us as individuals.
Again, these things come out of America. So they're really America's gift to the world.
Can we give it back? We want to return it.
No. It's America's gift to the world in terms of the fact that America has a tainted history. It's never got away, again, I'll be theological, it's never got away really from its original sin of slavery. It's still dealing with it, even though the Civil War freed the slaves, 160 years ago. they've never quite come to, partly because of what happened after the war and the way in which hatreds. I mean, you got rid of serfdom, for example, in Russia. Nobody talks about serfdom in Russia any longer, but slavery still matters in America. They both got rid of about the same time.
Today, as I was saying earlier, we hear the use of the term conservative a lot to describe the centre-right of Australian politics. Do you think that is a good thing, or do you think it neglects some of those prouder aspects of our political traditions? Because really that you see Liberal, yes, the Liberal Party, capital L Liberal, but the term Liberal to describe people of a particular set of political beliefs is becoming less and less popular. So, really the use of the term conservative is totally mainstream now. I mean, John Howard, I think, has a lot to do with the development of this term, the mainstreaming of this term to describe the centre-right of Australian politics. But is that because he sort of rebranded liberalism to become conservatism, do you think?
Yeah, I think John Howard's odd in some ways in this regard. He did rebrand conservatism, or he gave it a new rationale, but in many ways one could almost look at Howard as being the last of the Menzies liberals because there's much in Howard, particularly in his support for the family and for small business, that I think you can trace back again, not to Menzies, and you can also include Malcolm Fraser as well. I think the three of them, people would say, Fraser and Howard were quite different. In many ways, they did have similar values. So you can trace Menzies liberalism right through the whole three of them. But he did feel for some reason that he needed to, particularly because the Hawke-Keating years were so difficult, that he probably felt that there was a need for a re-evaluation, when in fact I wonder whether he changed a lot at all. That's if you know what I mean. It was on the surface, but I think there were still values there, particularly the family. The one thing that strikes me about Menzies, Fraser and Howard was how important the family was. That's something that I don't know how contemporary liberals deal with.
Do you think Santa Maria, so B.A. Santa Maria, who you were saying before was writing a lot of the Catholic social justice statements, do you think he had an influence on people like John Howard going into the 80s and 90s?
Did he have an influence on Howard? He may have. Again, the thing you've got to understand about Santa Maria, someone reiterated this to me many years ago, he was neither a capitalist nor a socialist. Hated both. He was a sort of middle roader. And there would have been things, I think, in Santa Maria, again, things to do with social stability, the family and so on. But there are other things about Santa Maria, such as using the state for various economic reasons or social reasons in particular that Howard would not have considered as part. So they would have agreed on some things and they would have had differences on others, I think.
Yeah, well, his views on property rights, I think, were probably a bit of a challenge to John Howard's.
Yeah, I mean, Santa Maria was quite interested, for example, in the way they do things in Singapore. He probably had a bit of a admiration for traditional Chinese Confucian values, just things like the social insurance and so on, which I think would have been far beyond which Howard would have considered.
Yeah. Greg Melleuish, what a fascinating discussion on all these important terms and terms that are familiar yet also unfamiliar in the development of their meanings over time. Liberals, conservatives, progressives, social justice. Really, really interesting discussion, Greg, and you've certainly taught me a lot in this 45 minutes. So thank you very much for coming on Afternoon Light again.
Thank you, Georgina.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.